Hello, my name is Indira Cameron Banks, and I'm a member of the Los Angeles County Bar Association Presidential Advisory Committee on Women in the Legal Profession. And this is part of our oral history project, recording women's experiences with gender bias in the profession. Having been in practice for almost 20 years myself, I personally see how some common experiences have changed over the years and how some have stayed the same. I'm honored to explore these issues with Ursula Hyman today. Ursula is a retired partner from Latham and Watkins, where she began as an associate in 1983. And she was a partner in the public and tax-exempt financing practice. She also served on their global mentoring committee, the Los Angeles Pro Bono Committee, and most notably for us, Latham's Women's Committee. In practice, Ursula represented a wide range of entities in financing and restructuring, from large tax-exempt organizations to real estate developers, underwriters, and banks. She has won numerous awards recognizing her achievement in law, in business, and in philanthropy, including an interesting award, the Disaster Saves Award for exemplary service and leadership from the American Red Cross and the Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA. She is a woman whose reputation precedes her, and you will hear her name mentioned if you ask around about women leaders in the legal profession that have paved the way for the rest of us, not only here in Los Angeles, but throughout the country. Ursula has graciously agreed to discuss her experiences as a woman and a partner at one of the most renowned and prestigious firms in the country. Ursula, welcome. I'm so glad that we have this time together.
So am I. Nice to see you, Indira.
So, Ursula, could you maybe start out by telling us a little bit about your journey when you started out in big law in the early 1980s?
Be happy to. First, I have to admit that I knew nothing about how law firms worked, what they were about. My whole experience with law was watching shows like Perry Mason and thinking I was going to be a litigator. And I actually did not go straight into law school. I worked as a university administrator for 7 years and then went to USC, where I graduated in 1983 and started with Latham. And except for my summer clerkship, didn't have a clue. But what I did have going for me was a little more maturity. I had been out in the world and I had had to present myself as a professional. I had made presentations. I had talked to groups of people in various, both one-on-one, helping them solve problems with respect to university admissions or financial aid. And that gave me a huge leg up than other first-year associates. So the first thing, and I think that's still true today when I was interviewing for people to join us at Latham, take a year or two off, go do something else, have a sense of what it's really like to be in the real world. But I did start a little bit later. The con on that is everybody just assumed I was a fourth or a fifth year. And so I got thrown into situations as a first year, which were amazing and so rewarding and terrifying at the same time, because I just didn't have enough experience or background, but I could get away with it. A little more poise, a little more, your demeanor, I think, is better when you're older. I mean, I think that's true. But I started in 83, and in 87, I was pregnant with my daughter. And at that time, no associate had stayed at Latham who'd had a child. The women who preceded me waited until they were partners, and they could do that because most of them had come straight out of law school. So they were in their early 30s or mid 30s. As a partner, I'm 35 and I'm a fourth year associate. And I remember the head of the associates committee coming and asking me when I was leaving. And I'm going, for maternity leave? And he goes, you're staying? And there was just this shock because they didn't have any program. They didn't know what to do with an associate who was going to stay after having a baby. And that taught the firm a lot. The firm truly recognized they were losing talented people because we didn't have the programs in place to keep them. In the last couple of months of my pregnancy, I was stuck in bed. And my then husband did this incredible setup. And we're talking the old fax machines, with the paper and the rolls and all of that. Set it up on a table next to my bed because I would have gone stark raving mad just lying in bed for 2 months. And when I came back after my maternity leave, and I'll come back to that in a second, our managing partner was so impressed that he started a program that any associate who became pregnant right away received a computer for home, received a fax machine for home, and was put in a position to try to make her transition back to the law firm and the last days of her pregnancy as easy as possible. And that was terrific. That also led us to talking about maternity leave because they had no idea what to do. And so they gave me a whole month off. Now, this is a bunch of older men making a decision about what they should do because the female partners to whatever they needed to do. Their expectations were based on different parameters than associates. So no idea. So I was given a month. I ended up with an emergency C and I talked them into 6 weeks. And obviously that wasn't enough. And we then formed a task force over the next couple of years to come up with a maternity policy that continues to evolve. But I think it is now something like 3 or 4 months paid leave and a number of other perks. Obviously, the technology has changed. People all have laptops and that kind of thing for the same reason. But that caused me to form a group as associates continued now to say, oh, there's a role model. I can get pregnant. I can have a child now. We formed a mother's group. And at a recent event, a friend found a memo from 1991 that I had written assigning to this whole group of women different tasks. One had to do with finding emergency childcare that was within close proximity to the office. What was the best technology in terms of equipment to have? What were the best strollers? How do you determine who your pediatrician should be? And all of these kinds of things. And we actually published our own manual, which became rapidly out of date, as equipment and stuff changed. But we kept that dialogue going. And that's very different than the Women Enriching Business program that Latham developed a few years later. But it was the first time there was an acknowledgement the women had to help each other and the firm needed to be a firm support.
Did you find, and just to follow up on that, did you find that the firm was, that all the partners at the firm were sort of willing to jump in and support the mothers group and sort of these issues of supporting mothers? And did you find a difference between the partners that were women who had children? Were they more supportive or less supportive? It seems like it could have been an isolating experience, but it sounds like you actually ended up with a great support team around you.
We did, but I think it really varied. I think there were a lot of the older men who had no idea what was going on because it was totally outside their experience in practicing law and having to deal with a woman who was either pregnant or who was dealing with a sick infant at home. I remember I was exhausted. I had had a sick baby up all night and she was about 11 months old, and we had a Cinco de Mayo party that was sort of mandatory. It was up at the old Lowry's, and I was there, and one of the male partners said to me, oh yeah, I know exactly how it is. And I lost it. And I turned and I snapped at him and I said, you don't have any idea. Vicky took care of those children when they were sick at night. And he just sort of looked shell-shocked and walked away. And he stopped by my office the next day and he said, no, you're right. Most of us don't have any idea what the women are juggling, and we need to understand. and he was the head of the corporate department at the time. And I thought, that is such a great acknowledgement that we have a long way to go. And the firm continues to constantly look at these issues. When I left in 2013, my parting gift to the firm was authoring a white paper with a group of other women onboarding and offboarding from the institution. And a lot of the trailblazing work in this area was really the accounting firms, the big accounting firms, not the law firms, but borrowing some of their techniques and understanding that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars go into training a really good partner from the time they start as an associate. You do not want to lose these women. What you want to do is find a way for them to be able to practice law and have some kind of work-life balance. Is it solved? By no means, but it's a lot better than it was.
What does that phrase mean to you? It's something, especially now with the pandemic, and we hear quite a bit, women and trying to achieve work-life balance. Is that something that is attainable at sort of all stages of a career and all stages of perhaps being a mother, or are there times that are better and easier? If you have any advice or guidance, I think for a lot of women who are experiencing that would be helpful.
So I'm going to say, first of all, that I think it's different pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. And there are a few advice or some ideas, at least I have, for women who are home during the pandemic and trying to work from home. First of all, I think it's a day-to-day occurrence. Some days you're going to be able to achieve work-life balance, and some days you don't stand a chance. It's not clear which side it was. One of our managing partners in the LA office was a woman many years ago, and I remember her telling me, when you are at work, you are totally at work, and when you're at home, you're totally home. That worked fine until technology started to rule our lives, and we started to carry Blackberries and started to carry cell phones and laptops and so on. So I think that has been a much harder, it's much harder in some ways to have work-life balance now than it was before. It used to be, when I left the office, I would always leave to try to get home to have dinner with my family, and then I would go back to work. I would either bring documents, but after they were in bed, I could work if I needed to work. But my cell phone wasn't constantly ringing, and I didn't give out my home phone that much. I mean, we had a central operator in those days who would only call us if there was an emergency. And so there were ways to put constraints. Now your cell phone's pinging and texts are coming in and so on. So learning how to discipline yourself to not allow those to intrude. I do remember advice someone gave me, and I've passed it on to numerous women, that when I had to leave for something like a school play or a soccer match or something like that, I put it on my calendar as a meeting. I didn't explain what meeting it was. I just put it as a meeting. And so my secretary would pull up my calendar and say, I don't know, she's at a meeting. And that was just easier. One Halloween, and I started doing this because one Halloween, when my daughter was about 5 and I was leaving, I heard someone make a comment about how great this male associate was, that he was going home to take his kids trick-or-treating, wasn't that great? And then that I was leaving, and someone like, well, doesn't she have any commitment to the firm? And you sort of go, wait, this is such a double standard, just because I'm doing it as a mom and he's doing it as a dad. So I sort of learned, I didn't hide it. I mean, if anybody asks, I'd say, yeah, she's in a play today, or she's in a ballet recital. But I calendared it. And once it's on my calendar, I didn't let anything intrude on it. I think today, I hear all these stories. I've been attending a lot of Latham events. Their 6-year-old would be behind them, and they're trying to work while their 6-year-old's trying to go to school virtually and say, Mommy, I need help here. I think this year, or the past 18 months, there is no way to measure how to keep a work-life balance. I think, in fact, what women were trying to do is cram the work in around their family crises of being home together during the pandemic. I think it affected development as lawyers. You come in as a first year, second year, third year, you need time with partners. You need to be in meetings with them. You need to understand. And when we get to the advice section, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of having someone review how you come across on a Zoom, for example, or what kind of, it's different than the old rule of, gee, how do you command a meeting room? That, used to be, you always had a position where you could be seen by people entering the door and you could command the table, but you weren't at the end of the table, and all of those silly edicts that we live by. But totally different when you're on Zoom and how you manage to control your environment. So yeah, so work-life balance, it's a day-to-day struggle. Get help. The best thing you can spend money on is really good assistance, whether it's cleaning your house or delivering your groceries or picking up your children. Give up on the fancy cars. I'll just turn this off. Give up on the fancy cars or the lovely home or the second house. Focus that on getting yourself relief so that your time can be with your family. And that's the best advice I can give there. I'll turn this off.
That's good. I think that is good advice, and that women should give themselves permission to get that additional help and still be a good caretaker and a good mother.
Well, I think it gives you time to be a better caretaker and good mother.
Yeah.
If I don't have to worry about scrubbing the floors, when I'm finished dinner, then I'm, and instead can go and sit in bed and read stories to my children. That's being a much better mother. Then one partner said to me, I just realized I can't have anybody over for the next 5 years because my house is a constant mess. And I get that.
I think a lot of people get that. A lot of women do get that. I wanted to move slightly to something you started to talk about especially when you started in the profession and you were a woman, and at some points in time you were pregnant, and you were in a practice area that I'm going to assume, and correct me, which was probably dominated by a lot of men at the time, and I think probably currently still is. Do you have any experiences or that you could recall about being treated maybe differently, or having to focus on commanding attention or commanding the room differently, in particular with clients?
First of all, within my profession, luckily there were women often representing underwriters and others. But when I did the big developer deals, I would always be the only woman in the room. And it would be interesting because if you couldn't demand the respect of the men very quickly, then you were going to lose the meeting. And often there was the expectation if you walked in that you were the paralegal, or maybe that you were the secretary. And I remember after one meeting, somebody saying to me, well, at first I thought you were a school teacher. And I said, that's interesting. I don't know quite how to take that. Does that mean that I commanded the subject matter so well that you learned something from this meeting? Or do you have some kind of stereotype of what a school teacher looks like? Is it the way I dress and whatever? And he thought about it and goes, no, I guess it's because I sort of felt like I was learning. He said, I don't think I meant it as an insult, but I laughed. Cultural, you have to be very aware of cultural differences if you are dealing with clients from another country. And we often attended classes that Latham would have about, because we have offices, of course, all around the world, so that if we were dealing in the Middle East or if we were dealing in Asia and so on. But before those started, I remember I was a young partner and a large Japanese development company wanted to do something and strike a public-private partnership with the jurisdiction. And I was meeting with them and I had a young male associate with me. And they would ask a question and I would answer, and they would turn and address the next question to the male associate. And it was sort of like I'd have to go, direct your, and he would always say, I don't know, Ursula, or something like that. But it took my showing, and I think a couple of times I had to say something like, well, in my 10 years of experience in this, or my 15 years of experience, for them to finally think, oh, in this place, in this country. Now that was back in the early 90s. I don't know if that would happen with a Japanese businessman today, but it certainly did it then. And he was a much older gentleman. I had a couple of times someone asked, like, well, who's the senior partner? If they weren't happy with the advice I was giving, and I would say, I'm the chair of the practice group. But if you're unhappy with the advice we're giving, I can give you the name and phone number of our managing partner. And they would go, oh, yeah. And so you would get that. But I think if you were well prepared and demonstrated fairly early on that this was your bailiwick, this was an area you knew, you had practiced in a long time, you had a lot of experiences, that you could get past that. And especially, it was funny, I mean, many of these clients are now my friends, guys who at first I just would be so frustrated with because they were developers who were used to just running roughshod over jurisdictions in the old days. And I go, no, not going to do it that way. We can't do it that way. So I think it's easier, but let me give two caveats there. I remember one of my fellow associates going out on her first meeting and the partner saying to her, by God, just don't do that flip your hair thing. And she wasn't aware of something she was doing like that. So I always think it's important in your early meetings when you are there with the partner or when you're growing to ask for critical feedback about how did I present myself? Not just in terms of my mastery of the law, but were people confident in what I said? Did I say it forcefully enough? And I'm not talking about yelling forcefully, but saying it with a mastery of the subject matter. And I had a couple of associates, again, this was a cultural thing, who when they were talking and they started to laugh, would put the hand over the mouth, and having to have a conversation about that culturally in the United States, how that would be perceived. And that it wasn't perceived as they're feeling confident. We gave training courses for some of the women that we'd identified who would talk really quietly because they sounded unsure. But it wasn't because they were unsure, it's because they had been taught to always, in their idea of respect, was to talk very quietly and very softly. And so we would identify women where those kinds of things were issues and do training with them because they were good lawyers. They just needed some help on demeanor.
That's an interesting point, and having the firms themselves invest in that type of support. That's
well, and I'll give you another example. We would have issues with dress, and this was more in the early 2000s. But if someone wore something that would be perfectly fine for going out on a date, it really wouldn't be perfectly fine if a client showed up. And I always got tasked with, would you go talk to this person? But that was an issue too. And so I think absolutely it's very different. Everything's business casual now. In our day, when we first started to move to business casual, we all kept a suit in our office as a backup in case somebody dropped in. I remember being there one week. No, it was a holiday. And I was there and I was in sweats and stuff. And I all of a sudden got a call from one of my partners that a very, very large client who I had done just a little bit of work was down in the conference room and they wanted me. And I learned my lesson then about not having had a suit in my office because I ended up going down in sweats and a sweatshirt and talk about having to learn to command the subject matter at that point, because I certainly did not look like a partner. So demeanor and dress, how you approach people, that whole thing about walking up and extending your hand first, and all of those are important lessons for women to learn. Of course, now I guess it's elbows first, but
So it sounds like, taking those, it sounds like taking those steps to command the room early is something that you found helpful in your career, as well as mastery of the subject matter. And what I think I heard you say is making sure that the client and other people in the room knew your experience and your mastery of the certain material without you even having to discuss it.
So if it was a new client, I normally sent a packet of information, which would include my bio, so they had some idea of who I was. If it was a meeting with existing clients and they brought in new people, I would find a way with the existing client to say, yes, over the last 3 deals we did, or the last 7 deals we did, we found this technique to be appropriate. But some way, especially, I never had the problem of looking too young, but especially if you look really young. I mean, if you look 19, it's hard to walk in with a bunch of 50-year-old guys and convince them you know more than they do about the law, not about maybe their business, but about the law. The other way, and this is important, you've got to study the company you're meeting with. I never walked into a meeting, unless I was called in unexpectedly, where I hadn't done my homework. And it's much easier nowadays to pull up on the internet and find out something about the company you're going to meet with.
That is solid, is having that experience, but knowing more, trying to know more than anybody else in the room, and knowing your client and sort of who you're meeting with very, very well. And I guess perhaps we don't get away with winging it as much as maybe some other people can in the room. So Ursula, I wanted to, thank you for sharing with us today, but also if there's any parting words or advice or anything that's come to your mind, I wanted to leave space here for that as well, that you think.
I wanted to talk about a couple of things. First, I wanted to mention Latham starting Women Enriching Business. That started, oh my goodness, probably back around 2000, might have been a little bit earlier. And it started as a joint effort between the New York and the LA offices. And at first, I think people looked at it really skeptically, like, seriously? And we started building a master database of all the senior women and up and coming women in the businesses and industries with which we worked. And now our events can have 1,000 or a couple of thousand people. And we started with small groups. And we also tapped alumni from Latham who'd moved into other industries to use them. And I will tell you that networking is so valuable, not only for being able to identify a new client base or expand your experience with an existing client, but also to just get right ideas in terms of how to change your business model or how to approach particular subject matter. So I cannot encourage women enough to find ways to form professional associations that they actually participate. So that's the first. The second is you've got to manage the technology. And I'm going to say this to all women, technology is a blessing and technology is a curse. And if you are trying to find a way, even to deal on a client deal, you can be sitting there bombarded, with 50 other clients and messages and so on. So spending some real time to manage technology, have a good assistant if you do, who can help get rid of sort of the extraneous noise. All of that will make you able to focus a little bit more and make that time you're dedicating to work more efficient.
Yeah, that's very timely too.
Yes.
Given the issues that we.
And that on the Zoom thing I mentioned, Indira, I was going to say this. What I've been telling associates that I still mentor to do is if they are on a Zoom session with another lawyer, especially a partner, that after the Zoom session, they talk about how they handle that. How do you interject yourself in a Zoom conversation? What kind of background you use. This kind of background wouldn't be appropriate if I was in a business meeting, but finding that appropriate business-like background and all of those things, being able to face the camera, get the right lighting, all of that is important if you're conducting business on Zoom. So you need to get a third-party feedback on that. So that's my last parting wisdom.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with me and sharing with all the people that are going to be watching this series.
Well, it's a lot of fun, and thank you so much for having me.